B-17 was already dying. Flames crawled along the fuselage like hungry fingers. The radio compartment had become an inferno. Aviation fuel poured from a ruptured tank, feeding the fire with every passing second. 3 men had already bilayed out, their parachutes blooming white against the French countryside below. Inside the burning bomber, a short man with a terrible reputation stared at the emergency exit. Every nerve in his body screamed the same message: jump now or die here. Staff Sergeant Maynard Snuffy Smith looked at that open door. He looked at the flames spreading toward the tail section. Then he did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He turned toward the fire. This is the story of the worst airman in the United States Army Air Forces, and how he became the first enlisted man in Europe to earn the Medal of Honor. It's a story about courage and cowardice, heroism and vanity, and one impossible afternoon over occupied France that nobody thought he would survive. But before we get to that burning bomber, you need to understand just how much everyone hated Maynard Smith. Thurley Airfield, England, April 1943. The men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron had a saying: "I'd rather fly one man short than fly with Snuffy." That wasn't hyperbole, that was policy. For 6 straight weeks, Smith sat on the ground while other crews flew into the teeth of German defenses. Mission after mission launched without him. Pilots specifically wrote his name on do not assign lists. When crews needed replacement gunners, they requested literally anyone else. The ball turret gunner position was the worst job on a B-17. You curled into a plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, knees pulled to your chest, 2.50 caliber machine guns your only company. If the electrical system failed, you had to hand crank yourself back inside the fuselage. If the aircraft took damage and couldn't land with the ball turret extended, you were crushed against the runway. Smith was perfect for the job physically. At 5'4", he could squeeze into that coffin-sized space, but nobody wanted him there. Nobody wanted him anywhere. "The man is a walking disaster," one lieutenant wrote in an unofficial report. "Lazy, argumentative, and completely unable to function as part of a team." The official records were even worse. Smith slept through briefings. He argued with officers half his age. He gave long, rambling lectures about philosophy to gunners who just wanted to play cards and forget about the war. His personnel file grew thicker every week, each page documenting another failure, another conflict, another reason why Maynard Smith should never have been allowed to wear the uniform. He was 31 years old in an army of 20-year-olds. He resented taking orders from men who looked like they should be in high school, and he made sure everyone knew it. But here's what the other airmen didn't know. Smith hadn't volunteered for any of this. A judge in Michigan had given him a choice: jail for unpaid child support or military service. Smith chose the uniform, not out of patriotism, not out of duty. He chose it because it beat sitting in a cell. The Army Air Forces got a reluctant recruit who had zero interest in being a soldier. Thurley got Snuffy Smith, the man nobody wanted. And on the morning of May 1st, 1943, everyone's luck ran out. The intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the wall map. A collective groan filled the briefing room. Saint-Nazaire, the submarine pens on the French coast. American air crews had given it a nickname that captured everything you needed to know: Flak City. The German defenses around Saint-Nazaire were among the heaviest in occupied Europe. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns ringed the target. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons based nearby could reach the area in minutes. The concrete U-boat pens themselves were practically indestructible, built with roofs over 16 feet thick. The 8th Air Force had been hammering Saint-Nazaire for months. The results were measured in shattered bombers and casualty lists that made commanders in England sick to read. Today's mission called for 78 B-17s. Statistical analysis suggested maybe 30 would actually drop bombs on target. 7 or 8 wouldn't come home at all. 75 young Americans would be dead or missing before sunset. In the back of the briefing room, Captain Lewis P. Johnson listened without expression. This was his 25th mission. His last mission. After today, Johnson was going home. He'd survived the most dangerous assignment in the American military. He'd beaten the odds that killed half the crews in his bomb group. One more mission, just one more. But when Johnson checked the crew roster for his aircraft, his jaw tightened. Ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant M.H. Smith. Johnson knew that name. Everyone at Thurley knew that name. A crew was short one gunner. There were no other replacements available. For the first time in 6 weeks, Maynard Smith was going to fly combat. Johnson didn't argue, didn't complain. He was a professional, and professionals worked with what they had. But as he walked toward his B-17 in the pre-dawn darkness, Johnson had to be wondering if his luck had finally run out. 78 flying fortresses climbed into the English sky. They formed up in combat boxes, staggered formations designed to maximize defensive firepower. Each bomber bristled with .50 caliber machine guns. Each crew scanned the horizon for the fighters they knew were coming. Maynard Smith sat in the ball turret beneath his aircraft, watching the English Channel slide past 30,000 feet below. This was his first combat mission, his first time over enemy territory, his first time seeing what war actually looked like from a B-17. The training had been theoretical, fixed targets, classroom instruction, range exercises where nobody shot back. This was different. The French coast appeared through the haze, a dark line separating sea from land. The formation crossed the Atlantic Wall doing 200 miles per hour, every man aboard knowing the next few hours would determine whether they ever saw England again. Smith had never fired his guns at an enemy aircraft. He'd never watched a B-17 explode in midair. He'd never smelled burning flesh at 25,000 feet. He was about to get a comprehensive education in all three. The flak started at the coast, black puffs appearing in the sky like deadly flowers. The German gunners had the altitude and heading calculated. They put up a curtain of shrapnel and high explosive, forcing the American formation to fly straight through it. A B-17 to the left took a direct hit. The wing folded. The aircraft rolled onto its back and fell toward the French countryside, trailing smoke and pieces of aluminum skin. Smith watched men bail out, watched parachutes open, counted 7 chutes from a crew of 10. 3 men rode the bomber all the way down. The formation continued toward the target. Saint-Nazaire appeared through the clouds, exactly where the navigator said it would be. The bomb bay doors opened. The bombardier took control of the aircraft, making tiny corrections as he lined up the submarine pens in his Norden bomb sight. The flak intensified. The German gunners knew American doctrine, straight and level for the bomb run, no evasive maneuvers until the payload was gone. They put everything they had into the air. Smith felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel punched through the thin aluminum skin. He rotated the ball turret, searching for fighters, finding nothing but smoke and flak and dying bombers. Bombs away. They lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive fell toward the target. The pilot banked hard, braking formation, getting out of the flak zone as fast as the aircraft would fly. They'd survived the drop. Now they just had to survive the next 300 miles. The formation turned for home. Behind them, Saint-Nazaire burned. The results of the raid would be evaluated later through reconnaissance photographs. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting back to England. Captain Johnson held the aircraft steady, climbing toward thicker cloud cover. The other B-17s spread out across the sky, each crew focused on the same goal: get to the Channel, get to England, get home. In the navigator's compartment, Second Lieutenant William Farenholt checked his charts and made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The formation was approaching the Brittany Peninsula, a distinctive piece of French coastline that jutted into the Atlantic. Farenholt looked at his map, looked at the coastline below, and convinced himself they were looking at southern England. "We're almost home," he told the pilot over the intercom. "Start descending." Johnson trusted his navigator. Every pilot did. Navigation over occupied Europe was brutally difficult. dead reckoning through clouds and smoke, no radio beacons, German jamming making instruments unreliable. If Fahrenhold said they were over England, they were over England. Johnson pushed the yoke forward. The B-17 began descending through the clouds. At 2,000 feet, they broke through the overcast. Directly below them was the city of Brest, France, one of the most heavily fortified locations in occupied Europe. Someone on the intercom said what everyone was thinking: "Oh God." The German anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately. The first shells bracketed the aircraft, explosions close enough to rock the B-17 on its axis. Johnson pushed the throttles forward, trying to climb back into the clouds, but they were at 2,000 feet, fat and slow and completely exposed. The fighters came next. Focke-Wulf 190s, 15 of them, maybe 20. They'd been patrolling near Brest, waiting for exactly this kind of target, a lone American bomber separated from its formation, flying low enough to make gunnery easy. The German pilots didn't hesitate. They came in from the sun, cannons blazing, 20 shells ripping through the B-17's fuselage like it was made of tissue paper. The left-wing fuel tank exploded. Not a Hollywood explosion, no fireball, no dramatic mushroom cloud. Just a sudden rupture, aviation gasoline spraying into the radio compartment, igniting instantly when it hit electrical equipment. The fire spread in seconds. Smith, trapped in the ball turret, felt the aircraft shudder, heard the intercom erupt in shouting, smelled smoke filtering down through the fuselage. He hand-cranked the turret back to neutral, squeezed through the narrow opening, and pulled himself up into the aircraft. What he saw made his blood freeze. The entire waist section was on fire. Flames covered the walls. Smoke filled the compartment. The temperature was rising toward levels that would melt human skin on contact. And 3 men were already gone. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Henry Bean. Waist gunner Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard. Waist gunner Staff Sergeant Joseph Bucasek. They'd bilayed out, jumped through the emergency exit, chosen the uncertainty of a parachute over the certainty of fire. Their parachutes had opened. German soldiers on the ground were already moving to intercept them. All 3 would be dead before nightfall. Smith didn't know that. He only knew the aircraft was burning, and he was standing at the edge of an inferno with a simple choice. Jump or fight. Every instinct said jump. Every survival mechanism in his brain screamed the same message: get out, get out, get out. Then Smith heard a voice from the tail section. Help me, somebody help me. Sergeant Roy Gibson, tail gunner, wounded during the initial fighter attack, trapped in the tail compartment, unable to move forward through the flames. If the fire reached the tail, Gibson would burn alive. If the fire reached the oxygen system, the entire aircraft would explode. If the fire weakened the fuselage structure, the B-17 would break apart in flight. Maynard Smith, the worst airman in the 423rd Bombardment Squadron, the man nobody wanted, the soldier who'd spent 6 weeks being told he was worthless, looked at that emergency exit one last time. Then he grabbed a blanket and started beating at the flames. The fire didn't care about his courage. Aviation gasoline burns at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The blanket Smith was using caught fire within seconds. He threw it aside, grabbed a piece of canvas, tried again. Same result. The fire was spreading faster than he could fight it. Every surface the fuel touched became a new source of flame. The temperature climbed. The smoke thickened. Breathing became difficult, then agonizing. Then the ammunition started cooking off. .50 caliber rounds were stacked in metal boxes along the waist section walls. Standard loadout for a B-17, thousands of rounds, enough to keep 10 machine guns firing through an entire mission. As the temperature rose, the brass casings expanded. The powder charges ignited. Bullets began firing in random directions. Smith was now fighting a fire, while live ammunition ricocheted around him. Most men would have run, should have run. Running was the rational response to an irrational situation. Smith didn't run. He started picking up the ammunition boxes with his bare hands. The metal was hot enough to sear flesh, hot enough to leave burns that would scar for life. Smith grabbed the boxes anyway, carried them to the waist gun windows, and threw them out of the aircraft. Box after box, his hands blistered, the skin cracked and bled. He kept working. Between ammunition runs, he went back to fighting the fire. He discovered the only liquid readily available, the relief tube. The crew urinated into a funnel connected to a tube that vented outside the aircraft. Smith disconnected the tube and used the contents to douse the flames. When that ran out, he found a fire extinguisher and emptied it on the hottest sections. When that ran out, he urinated directly on the burning surfaces. The German fighters hadn't finished with them. They could see the smoke trailing from the crippled bomber. They knew a damaged B-17 was an easy kill. They came in for repeated attack runs, 20 cannon shells punching new holes through the fuselage. Each attack forced Smith to abandon firefighting and man the waist guns. He'd never fired at an enemy aircraft in his life. His training had been classroom theory and fixed targets. Now he was swinging a .50 caliber machine gun at fighters screaming past at 300 miles per hour, squeezing the trigger in short bursts, trying to fill the air with enough lead to discourage another pass. Then back to the fire. Then back to the guns. Then back to the fire. For 90 minutes, Maynard Smith performed a one-man firefighting and defensive operation that should have been physically impossible. The man who'd spent 6 weeks being told he was useless was now the only thing standing between 6 surviving crewmen and certain death. Up in the cockpit, Captain Johnson fought his own battle. The controls were damaged. Several vital cables had been severed by cannon fire. The aircraft wanted to dive, to roll, to do anything except fly straight and level. Johnson wrestled with the yoke, coaxing every possible mile out of a machine that was dying around him. They needed to reach England. They needed to find an airfield. They needed to land before the fuselage burned through completely. Behind him, in the smoke and flame and chaos of the waist section, Smith had finally gained the upper hand. The fire was dying. The ammunition was gone. The tail gunner was still alive. But the English coast was still miles away. And the B-17 was held together by little more than faith and aluminum fragments. The English Channel stretched below them like hammered steel, cold, gray, unforgiving. A B-17 that went down in those waters gave its crew approximately 4 minutes before hypothermia set in. Rescue was possible but unlikely. The Channel had already swallowed hundreds of American airmen in the first months of 1943. Johnson could see the fuel gauges dropping toward empty. The ruptured tank had dumped most of their reserve over France. What remained was barely enough to reach the English coast. Maybe, if the headwind stayed light, if the remaining engines held together, if the fire-weakened fuselage didn't tear itself apart from aerodynamic stress. Behind him, Smith had won his battle with the flames. The waist section was a charred ruin, melted wiring, scorched metal, the smell of burned rubber and aviation fuel saturating every surface. But the fire was dead. Smith crawled aft to check on the tail gunner. Sergeant Roy Gibson was conscious but badly wounded. Shrapnel had torn through his legs and torso during the initial fighter attack. He'd been trapped in the tail section throughout the fire, unable to move forward, unable to help. Able only to wait and hope the flames wouldn't reach him. Smith administered first aid with the aircraft's emergency kit. He bandaged the wounds as best he could, made Gibson as comfortable as possible in the cramped tail compartment. Then he returned to the waist section and manned the guns again, watching for German fighters that might have followed them over the channel. None came. The Focke-Wulfs had turned back at the French coast, unwilling to venture over open water where British Spitfires patrolled. The crippled B-17 limped toward England alone, trailing smoke from dozens of holes in its aluminum skin. The coast of Cornwall appeared through the haze. Johnson began looking for any flat surface long enough to land a four-engine bomber. Normal procedure would be to return to Thurley, their home base in Bedfordshire. That was impossible. The aircraft would never survive another 200 miles of flight. They needed to land immediately. RAF Predannock sat on the southwestern tip of England, a grass airfield originally built for coastal defense fighters. The runway was short by B-17 standards. The facilities were minimal. But it was flat, it was close, and it was their only option. Johnson lined up his approach. The landing gear extended. 3 green lights confirmed the wheels were down and locked. He reduced power and let the battered aircraft sink toward the grass strip. The touchdown was smooth. Johnson had flown 25 missions and survived everything the Luftwaffe could throw at him. He knew how to land a damaged bomber. The wheels touched, the aircraft rolled, and for a moment it seemed like the ordeal was finally over. Then the fuselage cracked. The fire had done more damage than anyone realized. The aluminum skin had lost its structural integrity in the area around the radio compartment. The stress of landing, the weight of the aircraft settling onto its wheels, was more than the weakened metal could bear. The B-17 broke in half just behind the wing root. The nose section slid forward, the tail section ground to a halt separately. Rescue crews who'd been waiting at the edge of the runway sprinted toward the wreckage, expecting to find bodies. What they found instead was Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith climbing out of the shattered fuselage, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages, his flight suit covered in soot and burns, helping a wounded tail gunner to safety. The ground crews counted the damage later. 3,500 individual penetrations from bullets, cannon shells, and shrapnel fragments. The B-17 had absorbed more damage than any bomber they'd ever seen. The fact that it had remained airborne long enough to reach England defied every engineering calculation. Captain Johnson wrote his mission report that evening. His assessment of Staff Sergeant Smith was unequivocal. The ball turret gunner's actions were solely responsible for the safe return of this aircraft and the lives of everyone aboard. Without his extraordinary courage and complete disregard for his own safety, all personnel would have been lost. Johnson recommended Smith for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went up the chain of command, squadron to group to wing to 8th Air Force Headquarters. Within days, a war correspondent arrived at Thurley to interview the unlikely hero. His name was Andy Rooney, 23 years old, a young journalist who would later become one of the most famous broadcasters in American television history. Rooney found Smith in the barracks, the sergeant with the burned hands and the disciplinary record and the reputation as the worst airman in the squadron. Rooney listened to the story, took notes, asked questions. Then he wrote an article that would make Maynard Smith famous across 2 continents. The story hit the newspapers within a week. Worst airman BCOMES greatest hero. The headlines practically wrote themselves. The misfit who saved his crew. The troublemaker who turned out to be exactly what they needed. The man nobody wanted who performed an act of valor so extraordinary that it couldn't be ignored. The Army Air Forces had been looking for heroes. The bombing campaign over Europe was costing thousands of young American lives. Morale on the home front needed boosting. And here was a story that seemed almost too perfect to be true. Within days, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was the most famous enlisted airman in the European theater. Photographers arrived at Thurley. Smith posed beside B-17s. He demonstrated the ball turret for cameras. He stood with officers who'd barely spoken to him a week earlier. The pictures went out to newspapers across the United States. Smith received mail, thousands of letters from strangers. Women proposed marriage. Children asked for autographs. Veterans of the First World War wrote to congratulate him. The postal clerks at Thurley had never processed so much correspondence for a single enlisted man. The men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron watched this transformation with complicated emotions. They'd spent 6 weeks avoiding Maynard Smith. They'd complained about his attitude, his laziness, his inability to function as part of a team. Now that same man was being celebrated as a national hero. The newspapers called him brave. The radio called him exceptional. The Army Air Forces called him exactly the kind of soldier America needed. The squadron knew a different truth. Smith had been genuinely heroic on May 1st. Nobody disputed that. His actions aboard the burning B-17 had saved lives and demonstrated courage under circumstances that would have broken most men. But heroism in combat didn't change the fundamental nature of the man who performed it. Smith remained difficult. He still argued with officers. He still lectured other airmen on subjects they had no interest in discussing. The only difference now was that he had a Medal of Honor recommendation supporting his sense of superiority. The attention went to his head almost immediately. Smith began signing autographs with a new signature, Sergeant Maynard Smith, CMH. The Congressional Medal of Honor he hadn't yet received. He told and retold the story of May 1st to anyone who would listen, and the story grew larger with each telling. Details shifted, emphasis changed. The 90 minutes of desperate firefighting became an epic narrative in which Smith played an increasingly central role. Other crewmen noticed the exaggerations, small inconsistencies at first, then larger ones. Smith began describing actions he hadn't performed, decisions he hadn't made, conversations he hadn't had. The core of the story remained true. He'd fought the fire, he'd saved the crew. But the decorations around that core became increasingly fictional. This was the paradox of Maynard Smith, a genuine hero who couldn't stop embellishing his genuine heroism. A man who'd earned respect through extraordinary actions, but squandered that respect through ordinary vanity. The squadron tolerated him because they had no choice. He was about to receive the highest military decoration the United States could bestow. Criticizing him publicly would reflect poorly on the entire unit. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved through official channels with unusual speed. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, reviewed the paperwork personally. The evidence was overwhelming: Captain Johnson's report, witness statements, the physical condition of the aircraft. Every document confirmed that Staff Sergeant Smith had performed acts of valor far beyond what could reasonably be expected of any soldier. Eaker approved the recommendation and forwarded it to Washington. The War Department reviewed the case and concurred. The medal was authorized. A ceremony would be scheduled. For the first time in the history of American military aviation, an enlisted airman would receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater. The date was set for July 15, 1943. Secretary of War Henry Stimson would travel to England personally to present the decoration. It would be the largest public ceremony the 8th Air Force had ever conducted. Photographers would document every moment. Newsreel cameras would capture the event for theaters across America. The story of Snuffy Smith would reach its triumphant conclusion in front of the entire world. The Army began planning with military precision. They arranged for a formation of B-17s to fly overhead during the presentation. They constructed a ceremonial platform. They notified the press corps. They coordinated every detail to ensure the event would generate maximum positive coverage for the war effort. They did not coordinate with Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. Nobody told him the date of his own Medal of Honor ceremony. Nobody confirmed that he understood the schedule. The public relations officers assumed someone else had handled the notification. The squadron officers assumed the same. In the confusion of planning a major military event, the guest of honor fell through the cracks. July 15th arrived. Secretary Stimson stood at the podium. The B-17s circled overhead, engines roaring. The cameras rolled. The assembled dignitaries waited. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was nowhere to be found. A search party fanned out across Thurley Airfield. Officers checked the barracks. They checked the mess hall. They They checked every building where an airman might reasonably spend a summer morning. Secretary of War Stimson waited at the ceremonial platform with the patience of a man accustomed to military delays. The B-17s continued circling, burning fuel the 8th Air Force couldn't afford to waste. Someone finally thought to check the kitchen. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was scraping leftover food from metal trays into garbage bins. The hero of May 1st, the man about to receive the highest military decoration his country could bestow, had been assigned to kitchen police duty as punishment for his latest disciplinary infraction. The officer who found him didn't record what was said. The moment was too absurd for official documentation. Smith was rushed from the kitchen to the ceremony, still wearing his work uniform, grease stains visible on his sleeves. He barely had time to clean his hands before Secretary Stimson placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The newsreel cameras captured everything. The photographs went out to newspapers across America. The story that emerged was carefully edited. The Army emphasized the heroism, the ceremony, the historic significance of the first enlisted Medal of Honor in Europe. They didn't mention that the recipient had been washing dishes when they found him. But the men at Thurley knew. The story spread through the 8th Air Force within hours. Snuffy Smith, the hero who couldn't stay out of trouble long enough to attend his own medal ceremony. The irony was too perfect to remain secret. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. Each time he climbed into the ball turret and watched the ground fall away beneath him. Each time he scanned the skis for German fighters and waited for the flak to start bursting around the formation. He'd proven himself capable of extraordinary heroism. But heroism didn't make the fear disappear. The 5th mission was his last. The psychological toll of combat had accumulated beyond what his mind could process. Smith began exhibiting symptoms the Army Air Force's medical officers recognized, but didn't fully understand. Nightmares, anxiety, inability to concentrate. The modern term is post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1943, they called it operational exhaustion. The doctors grounded him permanently, no more combat flying. The Medal of Honor recipient who'd saved 6 lives over Brest would spend the rest of his war behind a desk, processing paperwork far from the sound of engines and gunfire. Smith didn't handle the transition well. He'd become accustomed to the attention that came with his medal. Journalists still wanted interviews. Photographers still wanted pictures. But the daily reality of his life was now clerical work in an administrative office, surrounded by men who'd heard all his stories and grown tired of hearing them again. His disciplinary problems continued. Perhaps they worsened. The official records show a pattern of conflicts with superior officers, failures to complete assigned duties, general inability to function within military structure. The same characteristics that had made him an outcast before May 1st remained unchanged after his moment of glory. By December 1944, the Army had run out of patience. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, holder of the Medal of Honor, was reduced in rank to private. The demotion was unprecedented. No Medal of Honor recipient had ever been stripped of rank while still in service. The Army didn't publicize the action. The contrast between the hero of the newspapers and the problem soldier of the personnel files was too damaging to acknowledge publicly. In February 1945, the Army sent him home. The war in Europe had 4 months left to run. The 8th Air Force would continue bombing Germany until the final surrender. Thousands of young Americans would die in B-17s over targets Smith would never see. He returned to Michigan. His hometown of Cairo organized a parade. The citizens who remembered the spoiled troublemaker now celebrated the returning hero. They lined the streets and cheered. They waved flags. They welcomed back a man who'd done something extraordinary on a single afternoon in May 1943. None of them knew about the demotion. None of them knew about the disciplinary record. They knew only what the newspapers had told them, A local boy had earned the Medal of Honor. Smith stood in the back of an open car and waved to the crowds. For one afternoon, he was everything the Army had wanted him to be. A symbol, an inspiration, a reason to believe that ordinary Americans could become heroes when their country needed them most. The parade ended, the crowds dispersed, and Maynard Smith began the long process of figuring out what came next. The transition proved brutal. Smith had never been good at holding jobs before the war. His personality hadn't changed during his time in uniform. He remained argumentative, opinionated, convinced of his own superiority. These characteristics had made him unpopular in the Army. They made him equally unpopular in the civilian workforce. He cycled through employment, tax work, clerical positions. Nothing lasted. Smith would start a job, clash with supervisors, and either quit or be fired. The Medal of Honor opened some doors. His behavior closed them again. Employers who hired a war hero discovered they'd also hired a difficult employee. His personal life followed similar patterns. Smith married again after the war. The marriage failed. He married a third time. That marriage also failed. Women were attracted to the heroic story. They were less attracted to the complicated man behind it. Child support obligations accumulated. Legal troubles mounted. By the early 1950s, Maynard Smith had become what he'd always been before May 1, 1943, a man who couldn't quite make his life work. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer somewhere. The newspaper clippings yellowed in scrapbooks. The fame that had briefly transformed him into a national symbol faded into the ordinary struggles of middle-class American life. He coped in his own way. He talked about the war constantly, told the story of May 1st to anyone who would listen and to many who wouldn't. The tale grew more elaborate over the years. Details were added, his role expanded. By the 1970s, Smith's version of events had him personally flying the damaged B-17 back to England, a feat that had actually been performed by a different airman on a different mission. Veterans who knew the truth said nothing publicly. The code of military brotherhood protected even difficult men from outside criticism. Smith was one of them, regardless of his flaws. The Medal of Honor he wore represented something larger than any individual. To attack his credibility was to attack the credibility of every man who'd served. The embellishments bothered some historians. The documented record of May 1st was remarkable enough without fictional additions. Smith had genuinely fought a fire for 90 minutes. He'd genuinely thrown burning ammunition out of a moving aircraft. He genuinely saved the lives of 6 crewmen. These facts required no enhancement. But Smith couldn't leave the story alone. Each retelling added new layers. Each interview introduced new elements. Perhaps this was understandable. The 90 minutes over Brest had been the high point of his entire existence. Everything before had been failure. Everything after was struggle. That one afternoon stood alone as proof that Maynard Smith was capable of greatness. He clung to it because he had nothing else. Maynard Harrison Smith died on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old. Heart failure was listed as the cause. He'd outlived most of the men who'd flown with him, and most of the men who'd refused to fly with him. The Army honored his passing, despite the complicated history. Medal of Honor recipients are entitled to burial at Arlington National Cemetery, regardless of their subsequent service record. The demotion didn't matter. The disciplinary file didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the blue ribbon with the white stars and the gold medal that hung from it. Smith was laid to rest among the rows of white headstones that marked the final resting place of American military dead. Generals lie near privates. Heroes lie near ordinary soldiers. The democracy of death erases the distinctions that seem so important in life. His grave marker identifies him simply. Maynard H. Smith, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Air Forces. Medal of Honor. The stone says nothing about kitchen police duty or disciplinary problems, or embellished interviews. It says nothing about the marriages that failed or the jobs that didn't last. It records only the essential fact. This man served, this man was honored, this man rests here. The question that remains is how to remember him. The easy narrative wants heroes to be heroic in all things. It wants courage in combat to reflect courage of character. It wants the man who saves lives to be worthy of admiration in every aspect of his existence. Maynard Smith refused to fit that narrative. He was difficult before the war, during the war, and after the war. He was heroic for 90 minutes and problematic for 72 years. He earned the nation's highest honor and the nation's frustration in equal measure. Perhaps that complexity is the most honest legacy he could leave. The 306th Bomb Group completed 342 combat missions before the war ended. They dropped over 22,000 tons of bombs on targets across occupied Europe. 171 of their aircraft were lost in action. The men who flew from thoroughly paid a price measured in thousands of individual lives, each one representing a family that received a telegram beginning with words no parent or spouse ever wanted to read. Maynard Smith's story became part of that larger history. The 306th Bomb Group Association preserved the records of every mission, every crew, every aircraft that flew from those grass runways. Smith appears in those records exactly as he was, a difficult man who did an extraordinary thing, a hero who couldn't escape his own limitations. Today, the National Museum of the mighty 8th Air Force stands in Pooler, Georgia, outside Savannah. Visitors can walk through a restored B-17 and understand the cramped spaces where young men fought and died. The ball turret hangs beneath the aircraft like a glass and steel egg. Museum guides explain how a small man would curl into the fetal position inside that sphere, rotating with the turret as he tracked enemy fighters through his gun sight. They describe the isolation of the position, the vulnerability, the absolute dependence on the crew above to crank the turret back into position if electrical power failed. Smith's turret lost power over breast. He cranked himself out manually and climbed into a burning fuselage. That detail alone captures something essential about aerial combat in 1943. Technology failed constantly. Survival depended on human improvisation. The men who lived were often the men who refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was not a natural hero. He was not even a competent soldier by most measures. But when the moment arrived that demanded everything a human being could give, Maynard Smith gave it. The 90 minutes over Brest revealed a capacity for courage that surprised everyone, including, perhaps, Smith himself. That is the lesson his story offers. Heroism doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require likability. It requires only the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of fear, regardless of odds, regardless of what came before or what might come after. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was a flawed man who did a perfect thing. That should be enough for any legacy. If this story moved you the way it moved us while researching it, we need your help to keep these forgotten histories alive. Hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Every single like matters. Subscribe to World War II Ember and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this from dusty archives every week. Real people, real heroism, real history that deserves to be remembered. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community stretches around the world and you're part of it. Tell us, do you have family who served? Do you know someone like Maynard Smith, complicated, difficult, but capable of greatness when it mattered most? Share your stories. You're not just a viewer, you're helping make sure these men and women are never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These heroes deserve nothing less.